riveted by all of their lectures, and they spoke to us right here. So this is a very special place, and that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted to be here. The other reason is because we have two very special people that you need to meet, and that's Jodi and Andrew Batay-Csorba. While it is customary for the dean to make these visiting lecturer introductions, I was eager to replace him as I've grown to deeply appreciate their work, their journey, their careers, and I was also eager to be here because, like you, I've not met them until tonight. And to be completely honest, I did not know much about them until very recently. I didn't know much about them. I simply got to know really of them. I discovered them and I began to follow them, to use social media parlance. Yes, they indeed have a very nifty Instagram page, which I encourage you to follow. But since then, we've exchanged emails and we've shared our creative work with one another. So my role now is to say the things that they may not say tonight. And to do that, I feel obliged to share the things that others have said about both Jodi and Andrew. So with that indulgence, first, in the words of our former dean, Professor David Chasko, who said, "Jodi and Andrew possess extraordinary creative abilities in the area of architectural design and practice. At this point in their mid-career as an exceptionally talented design professionals, they have become one of the most accomplished and recognized architectural designers of their generation. To date, their body of accomplishments is both extensive and impressive, such that few could match in a career lifetime with such recognition as their recent 2018 Progressive Architecture Award for their project Misfit Fit. This is one of the industry's most coveted design awards, and they snagged it. They've also received the 2018 Ontario Association of Architects Excellence Award for their project Double Duplex. They each received the 2017 Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's Young Architects Award, and they are both recipients of the 2015 and the 2016 Canadian Architects Award. And of course, they were the recipients of the 2015 Change Next Generation Award. Their former Lawrence Tech professor, Keith Kolar, who is here tonight, has said, while outstanding design is essential to the success of any firm, managing the office, its multiple projects, client relations, marketing, and developing a firm culture is just as important for long-term success. Jodi and Andrew work side by side, and their reliance on one another allows this to happen. It makes their architectural practice a unique partnership. Their former employer, Tom Main of Morphosis, has said, based on the role they played in my studio, it is no surprise that in their own practice, Jodi and Andrew bring great energy and love for craftsmanship in their work. With a strong focus on site, typology, materiality, and movement, Jodi and Andrew bring an unwavering pursuit of overall design integrity to each project with which they are involved. Finally, in their own words, Jodi and Andrew will tell you, our unique partnership, our intensely collaborative method of working, our joint commitment to vision, design philosophy, and reliance on one another make for a team that cannot be separated from the whole. Our discipline and passion for design excellence has become a meaningful and inseparable part of our daily lives. These are the reflections of others, and these are the words of our guests and their friends. In my mind, the work of these architects, as evidenced by their modest, award-winning practice, is without equal. I submit that this is one of the most important practices of architecture in North America, and this practice was actually curated here in Detroit. They then moved to California, working for Gensler, Gehry Partners, Morphosis, among others. Batay-Csorba had then moved to Toronto and continued to rack up accolades. Perhaps the journey of this accomplished duo could not have happened if they hadn't graduated from Lawrence Tech. I think we all recognize that architecture as a practice is very difficult to do in isolation. For instance, most of us have associates that we collaborate with, offices in fact, but in this special instance, both Jodi and Andrew rely on one another to produce the firm's work, and they celebrate the awards they've earned together, and tonight they're back with us to be with you. Noteworthy firm partnerships from my epoch included Ray and Charles Ames, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, as well as Patricia and John Patkow. Today's power couples now must include Billy Shin and Todd Williams, Bridget Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, as well as Elizabeth Diller and Richard Scofidio. When we invoke their names, we think of each as good alone, but they're better together. So tonight we need to add one more partnership to this powerful list. Tonight I have the distinct honor to introduce to you Jodi and Andrew Batay-Csorba. How should we turn this off?
Is yours on? Can you hear us? Yeah, no? Yep, good.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that introduction. That
Yeah.
was a little bit surreal. Having kind of, and this whole, I think, thing for us has been a little bit surreal. It feels like we're still in school in a way. Up here kind of presenting our projects to our teachers and professors, and then, to hear the relationships that you make, it's a little bit, it's very crazy for us.
Thanks, Mark, for the introduction and the kind words. And thank you for the invitation to lecture here, Dean Dubman and the Assistant Dean Schall. It's great to be back at Lawrence Tech. Andrew and I graduated the undergrad program in 2002. So it's been 20 years since we started here at Lawrence Tech in our first term. And we met here at Lawrence Tech in our first week of school a long time ago. And it means a lot to us to be able to come back here and lecture and to kind of give back and hopefully inspire kind of the next generation of students. I think the time we spent here at Lawrence Tech was pivotal in becoming kind of who we are today and in shaping kind of our pedagogy and kind of our interests, and the teachers that we had here, I think were a big part of that. Keith Kohler was one of our studio instructors, and he's kind of remained a mentor to us throughout the years. Rochelle Martin, Eric Hemingway, Paul Wang, and David Chasko. We've remained in contact with them. So we stayed in Detroit and worked after graduating. I worked at Bedison Architecture and Design, and Andrew at Smith Group. And ironically, we were just talking about this earlier, but Andrew had just finished designing a YMCA in his fourth year studio project. And Smith Group was just doing the Detroit Bull Family YMCA, which they kind of gave him a shot at, and he ended up being the lead project designer on, which it was just kind of ironic that he had just done that in his studio project. And after working for a year in Michigan, we went to grad school at UCLA. And then after that, we stayed for another 5 years in LA and worked. I worked at Gary Partners, Morphosis, and Gensler. And I was project designer and project architect, and Andrew worked at Morphosis for the 5 years as a project designer. And you were working on cultural and institutional projects, probably 20 plus of them, real and competition projects. And in 2010, we moved to Toronto, and let's see here. So this is some of the work that we have done in the last 8 years. About 75% is low-rise single-family residential and multi-unit residential work. And the remaining is commercial offices, retail interiors, restaurant and coffee shops. We've always been an office of 2, Andrew and I, with kind of like one other person here and there. And this summer we grew to an office of 5. And everyone always asks, why did you move from LA to Toronto? And I think both Andrew and I just, we always kind of wanted to come back to our roots. And we saw Toronto as a city in its early stages of growth, and we very much wanted to be a part of the discourse and development of Toronto. Like so many other growing cities, there's a struggle to keep up with the rate of development and growth, and we saw a huge potential for Toronto's low-rise residential fabric that helps steer us towards Toronto. From the first time we visited Toronto, we became fascinated with the semi-detached housing typology. So this house on the right here specifically stimulated our fascination with the typology. Kind of the placement of the window in the middle of the party wall alludes to the fact that the internal organization of the 2 units could be separated from the contextual facade. And this provides the opportunity to insert kind of a Trojan horse that complies in one way with a certain contextuality and to the city's zoning bylaws, but internally provides something altogether different. And it was that house 8 years ago that gave us the confidence that there could be a way to rethink low-rise density in Toronto, that maybe the Trojan horse is the way into the low-rise development, that maybe we can weaponize context, so to speak. And that spurred a lot of our low-rise residential work in Toronto, which has been the focus of the majority of our work. So we try to situate all of our projects based on a larger discourse. And it's always been very important for us to frame positions that begin to govern our objectives and identity. These positions are things that we're most fascinated with and what we spend the majority of our time kind of obsessing over. So the first one is we approach all our work, regardless of scale, with a public prerogative and giving focus to public communal spaces and a building seat within the greater city, whether it be a single-family home or a 300 square foot interior fit-out. The second, we produce narratives between our buildings and their context to provide coherence and continuity, thinking of context not from a historical argument for semiotics and mimicry as a driver of abstracted massings and geometry. Number 3, creating facades that interacts with the public and neighboring buildings, producing perceptual effects relative to users in the building context, most of the time walking a fine line between playful and adversarial. And number 4, questioning the role of landscape and evolving landscape from a picturesque model to new synthetic potentials that are collapsed within the architecture itself.
Okay, so first project we're going to talk about is Double Duplex. So Double Duplex is located in the Parkdale neighborhood of Toronto, which is kind of known for its old Victorian, Edwardian housing stock and tree-lined streets. So that the original house that sat on here was somewhat smaller than the rest of the neighborhood's properties, and it sat on a double wide site. This was a development project, and like Jodi said, for some reason we got into, just because of our fascinations with this really crappy old duplex building in Toronto, we got fascinated with the possibility of housing. And we started to do a series of these development projects with first-time developers. And it was interesting in the fact that these people knew nothing about development or nothing about architecture, but that they wanted to do something and make a difference and make and kind of change the discussion in the city in regarding housing. And so we've kind of ended up in these just fantastic collaborations with our clients, and this is kind of is one of them for sure. And so we got the site, first development project for this client, and we decided to sever the site, and instead of sever the site and put up 2 4-story, 3,500 square foot duplexes. The duplexes are divided in each of the houses, 2 floors for the upper unit, 2 floors for the lower unit. So we started this project like various neighborhoods in Toronto. There's an incredible amount of historical building fabric that you must contend with. And so our way into this project was to kind of abstractly analyze the bay and gable typology, which was very prevalent in that neighborhood. And so the diagrams you see on the left are the beginnings of that, where we begin to look at how the geometry can make the relationships to the context instead of using semiotics or using decorative motifs, or even below some of the brick coursings, which is beautiful, but we wouldn't have an opportunity in the context of this project to and budget to even go there. So the vertical element of the bay turns into the 2-story brise-soleil. We have the small roof elements that on the left actually connects. Right here is the neighbor's roof, so we're kind of mimicking that. And then on the right side, the roof is connecting to the top datum of their roof and then connecting to the height of their porch. The lower level becomes brick using the neighborhood red brick. And so I mentioned before, the brick coursing details on the bottom are just incredible in that neighborhood, seen throughout all these buildings. And that was kind of one of the main parts that we had to contend with. And we're really struggling with how we turn, how we translate that 19th century craft into our building in a way that we can afford, in a way that our client can afford to do in a development project. And so we found a way into that through the brise-soleil, 2-story brise-soleil. And so there was a kind of another way that we entered the brise-soleil. We had a kind of material, detail, and structural kind of investigations, but we wanted to kind of embed it with something else. And we saw the opportunity, just the sheer scale of this facade, that we wanted to find some way of interacting with the context in the neighborhood in the same way that a porch culture would. And so we decided to try to embed a game into the facade. And so we started by looking at kind of various games, and we ended up choosing cloud watching. So cloud watching is a children's game of projecting meaning onto abstract cloud formations. So we ended up embedding a series of animal profiles into the screen, the brise-soleil screen. And so within the horizontal elements, which there's two different angles, used both front and back, we embedded a giraffe, a panther, a crocodile, a bear, raccoon and camel. On the left here, you can see one of our lighting tests at night. It kind of brings up the camel profile. So we wanted the game to be subtle, and we really went back and forth in the office about how much we would be able to reveal the animals. And we structured it such that at different times of day, during different times of year, that certain parts of these animals would be visible to people. And so we really struggled with the relationship between, kitsch on one hand and kind of a subtle game on the other side. And so we bordered on more subtlety than kind of overtness. The screen was ended up being somewhat of a design build project for us, and we didn't kind of set out our practice as a design build practice per se. I think for us, we kind of get into these situations where we just want to do something, and we just figure it out to the point where we're like, okay, if we have to build it and take a couple weeks off the practice, and we'll go out there and build it, can we build it? And I wouldn't say we're the most skilled craftsmen out there. So what we do ends up, the way it's built and the way we're using digital fabrication is really about kind of ease of construction. And so in this case, the elements are broken down into 4 elements. So we have the steel angles with welded metal tabs that hold the vertical elements. We used a thermally treated wood from Nova Scotia. The vertical elements receive the CNC pattern directly from our model, and then we have the 2 different horizontal pieces that either go front and back. And so this was produced in the living room. So we broke down the facade into 6 units, and each of those units would be produced in the living room. We had 1 furniture maker and 3 neighbors doing the work. One of them was a DJ at night, and 2 of them were kind of in between jobs, let's say. And the furniture maker had experience doing a lot of rigging. And so they would build these things in there, they kind of got into it once you kind of did 1 or 2, and they flew through them, and they'd rig them up, lift them up into place, and then bolt them in. And so this kind of changed the way that we produced our drawings. And so we always talk about the kind of drawings as IKEA instructions in a way, and to simplify them in those terms so that there's not a discussion about complexity of the construction. So during the day, the screen is activated by the sun and its environments. At night, internal lights kind of glow the facade, make it look like a lantern, or I like to think of it as a kind of some type of jack-o'-lantern. Internal organization. So we 2 levels for each of these, and so we have to utilize a basement. And so transgressing that basement feel and the idea of people purchasing a house and living in the basement, we needed to really transform that space. So we produced 2 courtyards on both the front and back, pulled the first floor in to produce a series of double height spaces on both facades. And that allowed us kind of full glaze facade, which brought in a tremendous amount of light into what is a typical kind of narrow and deep Toronto floor plate. And so that's the kind of organization for the lower unit. The top one is organized around a light well in the center. and then 2 exterior spaces, one behind the 2-story Brise Soleil, and then one off of the top floor. So here you see the plans from the basement over here. On this side, first floor with kind of open to below, it becomes more of a loft feel. Second floor, and then third. So here's a great example of the dappled lighting effect that comes through the screen. Both on the left is the upper levels dining room, and on the right is one of the 2 bedrooms on that overlook into that double height space. So the materials for this project were purposely left kind of raw and minimal, partly because of, or largely because of budget, but because of kind of a loft feel that our client was looking for. But we had a problem of using kind of Home Depot floor joists for an exposed structure, which wasn't kind of ideal for a situation like that. So what we did is we took the structural blocking that had to be already in the structure and in the ceiling and multiplied that throughout, brought some of them down and some of them up, and produce a kind of dense texture, bringing the texture from the outside in. On the lower courtyards, we had a local graffiti artist produce a series of murals for us, and these really activated these concrete walled courtyards and really pulled the kind of interior space to the outside, really kind of extending the space. Even though in Toronto we can't, it's not as usable, we're still always interested in the perception of that space and how you feel inside when you have the ability to stretch that perception outside. Here is one of the drawings that we kind of started doing as a small kind of research project. We kind of liken them to the children's paper doll chains. And for us, it was a way of exploring how to simultaneously illustrate both section plan and a kind of spatial quality in the project within the same drawing.
Okay, so the triple duplex project here was a speculative low-rise housing model that we did as part of a proposal that the architecture critic Alex Bozowick hosted for the Globe and Mail newspaper, which is kind of like New York Times for Canada. Which looks at alternative development models in Toronto to densify underutilized residential neighborhoods. He asked 4 international firms for proposals to initiate a conversation within the city that looks to alter current planning regulations. Our proposal was a continuation of the low-rise multi-unit research that we've been conducting over the past 8 years, and which has included 8 projects within Toronto's residential neighborhoods. All of our low-rise projects and proposals we've done look at A, how can we spread out growth and even out distribution of urban density. B, provide new economic models for home ownership that could allow people to purchase and also help supply the housing market, such as being a landlord and renting out a portion of the property. And C, how to do it sensitively so that we keep the character of existing neighborhoods. So our article was the first to be published in the series last month, and it was followed by the second proposal by Lorcan O'Hurley from LA. So ours actually came out with this huge headline that said the BCI proposal challenges hypocrisy in Toronto planning. So it did set a pretty good tone for the argument of the series and got quite a bit of attention. So this map here, actually, first I guess I'll say that the population of Toronto is roughly, the GTA is roughly 6 million. And by 2041, the number of people living downtown is expected to more than double. So the question is, how do we add enough density to catch up with all this growth? So for those who haven't been to Toronto, the city has neighborhood after neighborhood of beautiful residential tree-lined streets with century-old Victorian and Bay and Gable houses scattered throughout the city, just minutes from the core. So this map here is Toronto's urban plan that shows the downtown high-rise core area in blue, which really only accounts for 30% of the land, yet the high-rise residential infill tower accounts for 70% of residential development. And then the white areas, which are the residential neighborhoods, which account for 70% of the land. So all the white areas here, yet the low-rise residential typology actually only accounts for 10% of residential development in Toronto. So while people say that we're running out of room to build in Toronto, there's actually a lot of room for housing Toronto's growing population, but it's planning policies that are only allowing new residents into these blue high-rise condo pockets while locking down the beloved residential neighborhoods. And now these policies are just handcuffing growth to only 30% of the city within these blue zones here. The zoning regulations within the residential neighborhoods are so tight that it's difficult to even build a secondary suite in a home. You're unable to apply for a basement apartment until 5 years after building new construction. You can replace a bungalow with a McMansion, but replace 2 McMansions with a triplex, it'll never happen. So the top left map here, the black areas on this map show the areas in Toronto that are predominantly semi-detached homes. So there's about 73,000 semi-detached homes in Toronto, which is by far one of the most common housing typologies in Toronto. To the top right, the map shows a population change from 2006 to 2016. Where more than half the city's census districts, 62%, have seen no growth, but instead a static or shrinking population. And then if we go to the bottom map there, which is an overlay of the top 2 maps and the areas where there was no growth or a decrease in growth, mainly overlaps with the low-rise housing areas where the semi-detached are overlaid here in the black. So this concludes that we need to spread out growth outside the high-rise areas and into the low-rise residential areas that account for most of the land. So the photo on the left here is Clinton Street, which is kind of a typical Toronto street with dense rows of these semi-detached houses with a prescribed front yard. And so the typical configuration to the semi-detached typology is basically a property that's about 18 feet wide by 100 feet long. And that's very common for most Toronto properties. And when you put setbacks on each side of that, it leaves around a 14 foot wide house. So pretty narrow, and 55 foot deep is kind of which is a zoning setback. And then you have your typical front and backyards that are stuck on the tunnel kind of a property that are normally disconnected spatially to the rest of the house. So what we proposed was to take the 2 properties for the semi-detached with the 2 units and to turn that into 6 units. We would reconfigure the 2 sites by utilizing the full width of both sites for each unit, giving us a wider floor plate, and organize the units back to back to back. So we essentially have 3 duplex units. The front duplex is accessed from the front sidewalk, and the middle and rear duplex units from the sidewalk between the homes. Landscape is now enclosed within the building envelope, providing a 4 Seasons courtyard that functions as a large living room entrance, a foyer for each unit. So that instead of having a front yard and backyard that used to be bookends, your outdoor space now participates as a room within the home, which can be open to the elements or closed off depending on the weather. And this space can also be used to increase the square footage of the home during winter months. So from the street elevation, you see we've very sensitively masked the building in keeping with the kind of small scale charm of the neighborhood. So it looks like it could be the same density of the context, kind of that Trojan horse idea that I was talking about earlier. So the floor and roof datums are enforced to neighboring buildings, providing continuity across the site. The masonry screens give a lightness to the double width facade and partially screen incoming natural light and retain the existing window scale of the context. The 2 entrances for the front duplex units are separated so that at first glance it really looks like it's a single-family home. So to access the upper duplex, you enter through the courtyard, and the lower duplex unit, you enter from the sunken courtyard to the right there, which also alleviates it from feeling like a basement, similar to the double duplex projects. So here we step into the entry courtyard of the upper duplex, where each of the 3 duplex courtyards would be clad in a different material. This one is clad in wood slats. The question we asked was how the outdoor space could be utilized all year round. And in addition to pulling the front and rear yards into the building mass, we also have exterior fabric curtains, which you can kind of see from, in the rendering here. That would kind of close off the front facade and the large roof aperture during winter months, and radiant heating in the slab and concealed kind of radiant heaters and a fireplace, allowing the space to be used all year round. So the first floor plan here shows the 3 back-to-back-to-back units that span the 2 properties wide. So each has their own triple height courtyard. 1, 2, 3. And separate entries and public spaces on the first floor here. On the upper units here, the triple height courtyards divide the plan in half, bringing the exterior space into the depths of the house with service along the party walls. So here you kind of have all the bedrooms that are right up against the courtyard, and then you have all the service against the party walls for each unit. And then in the basement, you have the sunken front and rear courtyards. And then we have clear story units all along the sides there that kind of make it feel less like a basement. So the view of the dining room looking kind of towards the courtyard there, you see the dappled lighting effects that the brick facade creates on the interior. And you begin to see what internalizing the front yard typology does when you spatialize it as a room within the house. It extends the boundaries of the home and makes it feel so much larger. And when the patio doors are opened up to this new covered outdoor area, it increases the square footage of the home by an additional 500 square feet. Here's a couple other renderings looking towards that courtyard. And then in section here, you, excuse me, you see the 3 units here. And how, excuse me. Thanks. And how the densification is almost hidden from the street here, with the kind of Trojan horse, as we kind of call it. So in conclusion, I guess our argument was if this strategy was implemented over time with just the semi-detached dwellings in Toronto, we could go from 73,000 units to 220,000 units, giving an increase of 147,000 units instead of the current stagnant and declining population growth of the low-rise residential areas. And this is the kind of a big move on numbers that the city needs and why it's so important to push for change.
Okay. So the next project we're going to talk about is probably our biggest project so far. It's for a spec office building located in the Liberty Village district just outside of downtown Toronto. So the project consists of a 6-story spec office building. The first floor has cafe and parking at grade, 4 stories of office space, and the rooftop has sculpture garden and event space. And so Liberty Village consists of a dense collection of masonry factory buildings, which over the years have been redeveloped into a kind of a creative hub for the city. And so other than the renovations of these buildings, the new stock and new additions to this neighborhood have come in the way of mostly the kind of typical glass office building. And so in contrast to that, we wanted to explore, could we find a way to produce a kind of contextually rich solution for an office in this context? And so what we began to look at was, Toronto's kind of immense precast concrete history as a way of moving the project forward. And so Toronto has several great examples of precast concrete buildings. But despite this prevalence in the city, the construction method has been met with great apprehension. And so we started to analyze it through several of the buildings, kind of seeing that the panels are always organized or aggregated in a very rigid fashion, which only kind of works to reinforce the kind of weight and heaviness of the building. And what we noticed too is that the windows are always part of the single precast unit, and that the part-to-part relationship is always the same every time, which really produces a static aggregation over the entire facade. And so what we did is come back to Liberty Village and start looking at the brick factory buildings. And so we started to look at the way that the brick began to allow these massive buildings to create a sense of movement and also break down the scale. And so by the use of different coursing techniques at windows, cornices, projections, they really broke down the kind of continuous surface of the brick in a way that we thought was incredibly interesting. We took that a step further, looking at a kind of dry stacked stone wall, and looking at the way that the kind of lack of continuity between all the different units and this kind of incredible tension and somewhat tenuous equilibrium that the final state of the wall finds itself in. And so here you see our proposal. So from our analysis, we designed, we had 3 panels. We designed each panel individually from one another and with no regard for the adjacent units or the overall aggregation. And so here panels confront one another and really highlight the differences between them and allow each panel to be read as a single unit within the overall aggregation through the kind of deep shadows produced by this misfit. So we designed 2 panels, and we just took the second one and rotated 180 degrees, and then we had 3 panels. Each of those is made up of 6 separate panels, which will go into the kind of fabrication method, but allows us to really provides us with an opportunity to take units out of a single pour to produce any number of window patterns and apertures. So the overall aggregation of these panels was incredibly rigid, kind of picking up on how some of the efficiencies of precast buildings. There was only a kind of subtle shift from the row below it. And that subtle shift, even though the panels are somewhat similar, they're similar enough to help us induce another layer of diagonal movement within the facade. So each panel is broken up into 6 units. We looked at a fabrication method which utilizes reusable rubber molds. And so we, in the context of the kind of financial context of this building material, we looked at putting the money more into the molds at the beginning and foregoing what is typically an expensive process of finishing the panels after the pour. So we were okay with the rawness afterwards and actually would prefer it and would put the money back into the front end of it. So each panel has 6 of these, and then you see here we can kind of take any number of them out to produce the window pattern so that the window aperture and that structure is overlaid and is not intrinsic to the structure of the panel. Here we have the corner condition, and so that was really important to us to kind of emphasize the discontinuity between the panels, and it allowed us to really expose their profiles. On the left here, you can pick up the kind of diagonal movement that the kind of subtle shift in aggregation picks up. Okay, this one's first. So this is an image of the lower level. So we articulated kind of the two big moves within the project was the entry and the sculpture garden on the roof, and those were articulated by kind of pushing the panels in, allowing the panels to reveal the corner condition, and in this case really trying to emphasize the weight and the mass of the building. On the flip side, we go over to the cafe, and the cafe is allowed to have a fully glazed corner, which really kind of plays up the lightness of the building as a contrast. Here we have a typical floor plate and an example of the various window configurations. And then going up to the sculpture garden, which again is kind of pulled in from the facade and oriented towards a specific view. Just check the time here.
We're going,
How long do we have?
you should,
Till tomorrow, yeah. Okay,
should maybe just
I'll try to speed it up.
go quick.
Yeah. So we've been involved in a series of our first kind of retail spaces. We did a headphone shop, which we're going to show, and then now we're doing a coffee shop, which both of which are 300 square feet, which the kind of varying scale is incredibly interesting to us, but allowed us a really a way to get into the details in a way that the development projects don't allow us. And so this is a headphone shop that sells headphones that are up to $5,000. And so incredibly high-end stuff. They sell headphones, earbuds, and small little amplifiers that are the kind of go-between in between your, let's say, your iPhone and the headphones itself. So the project is located in one of a kind of nondescript plinth that's below a series of residential towers on really the northern edge of the city. And so our client for this, it was an audio expert that really challenged us to develop a kind of new structure for a retail store. So if the typical is really focused on efficiency of transaction over customer experience, we really wanted to kind of flip that on its head in a way. And so in this store and how his business works is people come into the store, really it's not a walk-in traffic, but they search it out and come in specifically for the product, and they stay up to 3 hours. And so they listen to different types of music in different headphones and different combinations of the headphones and amplifiers and music. And it's this kind of incredible kind of testing laboratory in there. And so we really wanted to kind of celebrate that. And in doing so, we developed 2 different kind of spatial atmospheres. So the first one was all about producing a kind of intimate, dark, tactile atmosphere. And so we were looking at like a jazz club or a smoking room. Something that you would be comfortable sitting in for a long time, not a kind of typical retail store. And so we did that through using a kind of smoked oak millwork, herringbone floor, a kind of lush velvet cushions, and small brass details in the millwork, and then the brass screws on the white plates. So the second and kind of contrasting atmosphere came out of the design of a shelving module. So we were looking at ways to display the headphones, and kind of looking at what would be the best view to see the headphone and how to hide the wires that come with the headphone. And so we looked at kind of highlighting this, this kind of profile view, which is typically the nicest part of these headphones. And by creating this bent metal unit that was powder coated white and then affixed to the wall with patinaed brass screws. And so this unit is then multiplied over the wall, ceiling, and back down the other wall, kind of producing a very immersive atmosphere. And then the portions that we wanted to use as shelves rotate 90 degrees, become shelves, and then are highlighted with another layer of LED lighting that's embedded into the wall behind it. Here's the floor plan, which is a very simple kind of L configuration. On the right, we have a kind of display counter with storage below, a small kind of glass display case. On the back is full height cabinets for storage, seating area, and number 4, which is one of the biggest elements, is building services. And so the reflective ceiling here on the right shows the shifting panels, which then coordinate to the portions of the ceiling that have that are backlit with the LED. So this is an image of a kind of glass display case that we lined in the blue velvet, and this becomes the display for the earbuds and amplifiers. And we really wanted to kind of take the precious nature of these products to a kind of level similar to that of jewelry. On the left, you get a really good example of how the kind of simple aggregation of the panels, but from different views, give you a kind of immensely changing, differentiated surface condition. Okay. I will flip through the next few.
Andrew can talk forever.
Okay, so core modern homes. So this was our townhouse development that we did. It consists of 7 units, 17,000 square feet. So this is located in a Leaside neighborhood of Toronto and along Eglinton Avenue, which is one of the main east to west thoroughfares in the city, and is now going to be home to the new LRT, Crosstown LRT. And so along this corridor is a very sporadic set of development right now. So we have 15-story residential buildings here. We have small single-family homes. We have kind of 4 or 5-story glass office buildings. And so we really used our building and the massing of it as a way to try to bridge the different sides of our building, one that was on Eglinton and one that was on a purely kind of single-family residential street. So we broke down the mass into 2 parts and used different color brick, black and gray, on each of them. Further looking at how to break down the mass, we kind of stepped back each unit from one another. And so, go quick. So this was a development project. Like a lot of development projects in Toronto are so precisely formulaic towards their kind of spatial and organizational performa, that we decided to not kind of confront that within this project, but to look for the architectural project in a different way. And so we looked at primarily two things, apart from the kind of general siding and massing, and that was kind of windows, the project of a window, of an aperture, and how to structure a kind of more public kitchen, living, dining floor. And so the windows for us became an idea of how we could produce spatially oriented aperture that kind of induces movement and visual interest within a very kind of minimal mass of a facade. And so these come out of a kind of exploration of a bay window, which are kind of littered all over the city in the Victorian houses. So we looked at kind of inverting that and producing an indentation and orienting them to focus kind of down the streets. And also the kind of carving then, again, kind of reinforces the solidity of the buildings. There's some images of them. So the plans, parking below, floor up is your kitchen, living, dining room. So this is kind of the main floor, the main public space as we look at it. And so this became a project of storage. And so we took on the kind of mundane project of storage and looked at a way to kind of redefine the space through that. And so we have a series of we looked at producing a kind of flexible millwork system that would incorporate kitchen, house storage, kind of open shelving, fireplace, kind of all in one wall of the building. So we could really incredibly tight sites, really focus and limit the kind of interior interventions and allow the windows to really bring the light in. Okay, are you gonna do this or me?
Yeah, I'll just quickly go through. This is kind of what's on the boards right now.
We always we always like lectures where you see something that you don't see on the websites. And these projects literally take forever, like 3 years. And so you're sitting there with 3 years not showing something.
Well, everything in Toronto is committee of adjustment. There's 2 zoning bylaws that they both conflict each other right now. So everything in Toronto that you want to build, you have to go to committee of adjustment, and
which is a year.
It's minimum a year. So it's like.
So, anyways, this is our kind of sneak peek of what we're hoping to then photograph next spring.
Yeah. So this is a residential project that's supposed to be complete in January. So on the left is a rendering. On the right is the construction photograph. So this is kind of one of those long, narrow sites in Toronto we were talking about.
This one is really structured around the client's necessity to have parking. And so in this super tight site, they wanted parking. We didn't want to fill the entire facade with a garage door, so we thought of producing a carport. And it was going to be the most amazing carport we could produce. And so we produced a carport, and kind of like this big kind of entry procession into the house. It has a clear story or kind of light well in the back of it that brings light down. And then if you go through it, we are kind of taking this brick detail into this vault, which is the kind of second idea of the project, which comes to the outside, and we're kind of bricking this vault space.
And the whole front facade is this Flemish bond with every other brick that protrudes out. And
interior space, like a lot of these projects, we find everybody loves kind of open floor plans. And there's this kind of conflict between open floor plans, but differentiated space. The short and long of it, we came up with this idea of kind of exaggerating the length of the space with the barrel vault, but then peeling it and puncturing it in a way that would produce a series of kind of different spatial conditions. And so here we get
that kind of like that differentiate each room.
And so this just happened last week. So we're like, oh, like drywall, amazing.
Just in time for the lecture.
So this is, another project, which is a small 2,100 square foot, 3-bedroom house for a young family, two kids. And the site is in an interesting place, right on the top of this river valley in Toronto. And so the main scheme is developed around this idea of producing this kind of 3-story circulation spatial condition that connects them to the kind of front yard out here, going through into the kitchen and then up into this amazing roof deck that looks out onto the river valley. And then we're looking at the brick and kind of cherry picking in a way different coursings in the neighborhood and kind of overlaying them on the building facade in a series of kind of striations.
And this is like a kind of historical yellow buff brick that's
Oh, yeah.
all throughout the city of Toronto.
Here, and then this is the kind of internal space.
Rendering versus the construction photo.
And then, so this is west facing, so at night when it hits the plywood, maple plywood, it really produces this amazing glow at the top.
Again, rendering versus
Okay,
construction
to
photo.
finish, we're doing a coffee shop, which has this ridiculous pattern made out of these custom wood pieces because we're working with an owner that owns a wood flooring store. And so we're producing this kind of caffeinated space. And then on the flip side, we're doing a virtual reality bar. And so we have these 7 pods. 17 pods. And we're using a series of these polycarbonate fins and layers to really kind of skew the visual perception of the people doing VR inside. I don't know if you've ever seen the people, but they're...
You look ridiculous when you're doing it.
So we wanted to highlight it, but also kind of really skew that perception of them.
And kind of like act like a veil.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
And that's it. And
We're done.
Yeah.
We're done.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, for sure.
No, just if someone has one. Go ahead.
We'll use the
mic is for the online, so if we can pass the mic. Sure.
So I know initially you guys were intending to do strictly like just design and executing that for the double duplex. When after like projects following that, how involved were you guys in the design and the actual construction process?
So the little headphone shop, it ended up being a design build. So we sent it out to tender. People came back and said, those panels are ridiculous. I'm not gonna do that. And we literally had astronomical bills. So similar to so anyways, we started hiring subs and just doing it ourselves. And then we ended up developing, we just CNC milled plywood, which was the backing in a kind of pattern on the walls that you would literally just, pop the screws in.
It located where all the panels would go, showing you basically a map of where to place them all. So we just basically
So we could
got,
do it.
Yeah.
So after that has kind of been the last one that we really...
But we basically do like a really kind of IKEA kit of parts drawings that allow anyone to put together.
Anyone, so we're the base level for the level of skill. And then, so if we can do it, then anybody can do it, kind of thing. Yeah. So we're trying to get out of that more. It's so intensive, and we lose so much money that it's not the best way to do it.
But it has been kind of our dirty little secret, kind of, to get projects built up until now.
What's your process of abstracting an idea? For example, the composition of this, what's it called? the stacked stone for the Misfit project.
So the composition. So
Well-
what's our design process?
Yeah, for abstracting an idea from some composition that you see.
That didn't develop compositionally. So on a lot of these projects, we kind of have vague ideas of what we're interested in, and then we kind of just fall blindly into them. I think we've learned, and even when we're teaching, the first thing you do is shit. So just get it done. And that the design process is an iterative one. That you literally, the way you design is by doing. So there are very few projects that we've ever done where we actually it's purely an intellectual activity that we think the project through and then just do it. So it's really messy. So a lot of models, we 3D print a lot of models, a ton of renderings, and just exploring. Yeah, so there's no magic.
That said, we do always have kind of like an idea of, like, for instance, the precast. That was something that we did a lot of precedent studies on.
Yeah, a lot of
and,
research.
Like the context, and then kind of that obsession of like the dry stack, the precast,
We let's say have positions on patterning. And so we, right from the beginning, we're looking at kind of material assemblies, patterning, as not wanting to go down the path of like a grasshopper, of a kind of gradient differentiated facade. And so we started looking at like kind of patchy, rashy facades, you know, so there's kind of in each project embedded a kind of a border of where to locate the project in the larger kind of confines of the profession, you know, so we're not purely aimlessly searching. There's a direction, we just don't know what that direction, what's going to come out of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Let's give them a, oh, go ahead, Deirdre.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question has to do with the collaborative process. So both of you had worked in other firms, and I'm wondering when you decided to launch out on your own, move to Toronto, you know, if you had to develop some sort of internal contract, or I'm really curious how that all worked out.
We started working together here. The first project we did together was
Was it in
was the Theta Tau
frat
house competition
Yeah.
that we were actually supposed to build with Keith. And that was the first thing that we had done. We did it when we were in Keith's class, and then we did a steel competition in Rochelle's class, and we did a series of projects and competitions together, and it kind of worked. That being said, everything each other does is not right. So it's not, we contradict each other all over the place, but we do it in a way that it still moves forward. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how, but
So, yeah, and then through grad school, we did all our work together. So there's always this idea, I think kind of this romantic idea of having our own office, not knowing at all what that actually means, which I don't think a lot of people do know. So there was always kind of in the back of our mind that we would do that. Yeah.
But yeah, like I think even when we were in LA, kind of doing our separate things, we knew that we were going to, you know, someday open our office together. And then I think it was during the recession that hit, and we both kind of finished projects that we were working on, and it was just kind of like the perfect time, and it was.
And we started it with
Let's-
0 work and moving to a different country in a city we didn't live in.
Yeah.
And said, we'll put the shingle up and Batay-Csorba Architects, hire us.
Yeah,
And that was it.
really
Like 0
we,
planning.
we just like totally jumped in, and we didn't moonlight beforehand. We didn't. Yeah, we just kind of picked up shop and chose Toronto to do it.
Yeah, it seems to
to
be
do
a
that.
kind of a trend of ours, of just kind of blindly taking chances. Like the residential stuff, Jodi had done some really nice residential work in LA. I was doing massive institutional projects. So it was like, to do a duplex was so far out of our mindset, but we didn't know what we wanted to do. We just had these ideas of what we liked and just started doing work, and it kind of has just grown, I guess, still going. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Stephen?
Thanks. And hi.
Hi.
So I want to go back to the headphone shop.
Yep.
I have a passion for music, but I've fascinated with the texture and patterning and the appearance of randomness. Well, one is, are there acoustical properties? It appears that there's acoustical properties to the design, which is very contrary to the fact that you're going to put headphones on and black out the ambience.
Yep.
But at the same time, it's a visual experience that adds to the experience. So can you talk about how some of those decisions were made and what's it sound like in there?
I'd say it started from a display infrastructure. So it started from the beginning. It's like, how are we going to display headphones? And so we always do this just ridiculously obsessive precedent study on every place that's selling headphones. What are they doing? How are they doing it? How does it work? And so it really started from that. One of the things with these headphones, the super high-end ones, is they're kind of ugly. They're really ugly. And so we, like right here, are literally, those are the nicest ones. And so our client was like, those can't be the biggest thing in the space. You can't forefront those. And so it came out of a utilitarian solution that turned into a spatial one. I wouldn't say it's an acoustical one. That relationship, I think, is coincidental with the kind of foam, spiky foam kind of acoustic spaces in recording studios.
You think the metal is acoustic?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
So she disagrees. It's totally wrong.
Like what? Like maybe the velvet upholstery on the bench is acoustic. I'd say that's all that's acoustic about the space, though.
We're really interested in producing immersive environments that you can really feel, and we're just fascinated by the agency of architecture to do that, to really make people feel something or feel differently, or kind of, we really like to mess with people's perceptions. And I think that's where a lot of the context stuff comes from. We like things to overtly connect with the context, but then not. And so you get the kind of unsettling feeling between why is this building seem like it connects, but it doesn't. And so I think playing with those things is just something we've really been interested in.
Any other questions? Now that I have the baton.
Then let's get Jodi and Andrew a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.